Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof.
I recently had the chance to sit down with Dr. Casey Luskin to talk about the science of human origins as it relates to William Lane Craig's new book, In Quest of the Historical Atom. So now, given Casey's expertise in both scientific and legal dimensions of the debate over evolution, I think you'll find his comments really insightful. Casey earned his PhD in geology from the University of Johannesburg and a BS and MS degrees in earth sciences from the University of California, San Diego. His law degree is from the University of San Diego as well, where he focused on the studies in First Amendment law, education law, and environmental law. So, given all that great background and the complete relevance to this study of human origins, I hope you'll appreciate our conversation. So Casey, before we dig in to this topic of William Lane Craig's book and the historical atom, maybe you can answer a couple big issue questions, big perspective questions. So first of all, why is the topic of historical Adam and Eve important to you to begin with?
First off, let me say, Joe, that it's been a real delight to meet you and your wife today, and really appreciate the opportunity to do this interview with you, and looking forward to this for a while. So why is this topic of interest to me? Well, I've always been interested in the topic of human origins. I've been writing on this topic for probably over 15 years. The first book I sort of published was Science and Human Origins. That was one of my first major forays into writing about this. But then also living in South Africa from 2016 to 2020, I had quite a few opportunities to actually visit some of the most famous fossil hominid sites in the world, and got to go on tours of them and go and see them directly. In one case, I even got to go and assist with some sampling at one of those sites. So it's been a passion of mine and just a personal interest for many, many years. Why? Well, my question is, why wouldn't someone be interested in the topic of where did we come from, human origins? I mean, I think it's one of the most important questions we can ask. What is our origin? Did we arise through unguided, naturalistic, evolutionary mechanisms, or are we created for a purpose? Were we intelligently designed? What is the nature of humanity's origins? Is one of those foundational questions you can ask. And so many other questions that we want to answer in life. Yes. What should I do? Who should I follow? What podcast should I listen to? Yeah. They all flow out of that one question.
Yeah, it is a big question. A lot of the people are studying it from a lot of different angles. And I think there was a while that it was sort of like in the back recesses of people's minds, other issues came to the fore. But certainly right now, in the last few years, I think this issue has come way more to the forefront. And that's where a book like William Lane Craig's comes in, where he's looking at his quest of the historical atom. And he's approaching it as anybody with this issue. And I think it's the right approach and it's very interdisciplinary. They're trying, instead of just purely as a theologian or purely as a scientist or whatever somebody's training is, I think one of the neat things we have in scholarship is an openness to interdisciplinary study. But that said, any of us that do that kind of work, you're included in that too, and I'm included in my work, there's the potential that you have sort of blind spots, right? There can be gaps in your knowledge because it's not necessarily your field of expertise. And that's not a negative, and I don't want people to misunderstand. We're not discouraging that, nor is it an automatic downgrade to Craig's work. I mean, he's not an Old Testament scholar, nor is he a scientist. He's a theologian and a philosopher. So he's taken on a lot of big issues here that are outside of his, technical expertise or as an academic, but that's not a negative necessarily. But I say that because as you read the book, did you notice any kind of maybe some of those gaps in his understanding, or is there something that really maybe surprised you on a big picture note of the content as you examined that?
Sure. And I just to support what you said, I'll be the first to admit that, I have my own blind spots. My training is in science and in law. I'm not a theologian. I don't have expertise in that area. I actually learned a lot reading William Lane Craig's book about some of the literature on the nature of myth. It was very interesting to see, these discussions about Genesis. A lot of these are areas of research that I really don't know very much about. So I certainly have my own blind spots as well. I think that's why only one of my 6 parts of my review was actually dealing with sort of the theology side of it. It was mostly looking at the science. So the title of the book was In Quest of a Historical Atom. And so I was expecting that the book was going to be mostly devoted to looking at the science of whether or not Adam and Eve existed. Now, I did appreciate, though, that William Lane Craig spent a lot of time looking at the Bible and whether it supported a historical Adam. Now, I would have thought you could do that in just a couple pages, right? But he actually spent over 50% of the book looking at Genesis 1 through 11, that what is their literature genre, what is their nature, do they entail myth? He ultimately, of course, concludes that what they are called what he calls a mytho-history.
Yeah, mytho-history, yeah.
And so much of that, frankly, had nothing to do with whether Adam and Eve existed. He could have simply gone, to the conclusion that Adam and Eve were historical people without getting into this huge, big analysis of the nature of myth in Genesis. And I actually think that, frankly, that, for my opinion, that was actually the weakest part of the book. Not only was it sort of irrelevant and extraneous to his core question of who were Adam, were Adam and Eve historical people, but it's also where I thought his scholarship was the least convincing, at least to my eyes, as sort of a semi-informed reader. I'm probably his target audience, not an expert in those fields, but somebody who knows a thing or two.
Yeah, certainly scientists are part of his target audience because he's trying to reach multiple people who are challenged with this question. So the take that you have, it may not be as an expert, but it's as a reader who's informed.
A non-crazy reader, I'd like to think.
Yeah, there you go, hopefully.
Yeah. So I felt like his arguments that Genesis was myth were highly subjective and really not very persuasive. I don't know if you want me to go into that now or we talk about it more.
Yeah, we'll get more of that.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Let's dig into that later.
Yeah.
I mean, because I know we have some questions they're going to cover that area. So let me just go over one more big picture question before we do dive in, though. So in your blog series, so it's how many, 6 parts now? I think the couple were still coming out when I approached you about doing this. So it's pretty extensive. You go into a lot of detail, which is great. But the first one, you talk about a sort of a warning to evangelical Christians about an error in understanding how we mix sort of or blend our science and theology or science and faith. So what is your overarching concern? So as people, and understand for people listening, when you're saying this is something to keep in mind over any discussion of this. This is an overarching concern, not just for Craig's book, but anybody who's writing on these areas of science and faith. You had some ideas to kind of point out to them, say, hey, look for these things, be aware of these things. So what are those things?
Sure. So, I'm an evangelical Christian. I'll just own that. It's always popular to say that. But us evangelicals often swim in this atmosphere or this ocean that where we're supposed to just believe that evolution should be treated like this immovable rock that should never be questioned. And as soon as you start to question evolution, you risk bringing shame and embarrassment upon the church. And you risk bringing disrepute upon the name of Christ. These are actually talking points that I've seen theistic evolutionists or evolutionary creationists, if you want to call them that, make to the church.
Yeah.
That if you question Darwin, then you are actually making Jesus and the church look bad.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we live in this world where we're supposed to sort of treat evolution as this unquestionable assumption. And what I wanted to say, and in my blog series in the review, is that assumption, there are many strong reasons that we should not be making that assumption anymore. We should actually be jettisoning that assumption these days, because we've seen that people who are making that assumption are actually leading us down a path of bad science to false beliefs. And they're causing us to actually get rid and abandon thousands of year old beliefs based upon what is really junk evolutionary science.
Yeah.
And so I want people to appreciate that you actually have the right, and in some cases, you have the obligation to ask whether evolutionary claims are true.
Yeah. And I think that's important. Now for folks understanding too, when you're saying jettisoning evolution or questioning it, there's a lot of times people trade in these sort of vague definitions of that. And you're not talking about all aspects of change over time, or that, stuff over years might change its appearances or looks. You're talking specifically in this context about the idea of evolution, meaning animal to humans. Did animals somehow gain some sort of function to become human beings? At least in this context, right? That's the main concern.
That's a big part of it. And also whether the show was unguided or at least appeared unguided. For example, intelligent design can be compatible with the idea that we share a common ancestor with apes. But what intelligent design says is that whatever happened, whether we do share that common ancestry or not, the mechanism of change was not an unguided evolutionary mechanism. Or at least it wasn't only that. There was also intelligent guidance. There was purposeful planning. And that's very important when we talk about human origins, Joe, because we want to ask the question, are we here for a purpose? Or did we arise through unguided, chance, naturalistic processes? And if it's the latter, I think that says a lot about, what we're here for on Earth. But if there's purpose involved in human origins, then that radically reshapes the way we view humanity, the nature of our value before God and fellow humans. Very important that we can say that we're not the result of unguided, blind evolutionary mechanisms.
Yeah, those philosophical assumptions then essentially guide the way we interpret sometimes the evidence. We're all looking at the same science, but it's our assumptions that go in that can often have a big impact on the way we see what we see. Let's get into some details then about Craig's specifics in his book. Now, for folks who have maybe not had a chance to pick it up, as you mentioned, there's two big parts to it. The first half, essentially, is his look at the genre of Genesis. I can't roll my R quite the way he does, but because he studied German, and so it's lived there for a while. So it's kind of a funny genre. But anyway, so that first half is that genre thing that he looks at, and he has this classification to read Genesis through this lens of mytho-history, which is his premise. Now, the second part of the book is really the science part. And that's the part where he's advocating some form of theistic evolution, that this process over long periods of time made animals sort of become human beings in some fashion. And he's a little bit open on that. So, most of our time is going to be in that second part because that's your background, that's your real expertise on that. But as it relates to this idea of human origins, that somehow at least 500,000 years ago, maybe longer, humans came into existence, maybe give your summary of what that argument really is about, or what is his case? How does he make his case for that?
Yeah, so scientifically, what Craig basically wants to do is he wants to see if we can take a standard evolutionary view of human origins and yet find that Adam and Eve could have existed within that standard evolutionary view. Mm-hmm. Okay, so he looks at the hominid fossil record and he says, okay, well, what species in the hominid fossil record look like based upon maybe the size and shape of their brain, their body shape, some of the behaviors that we can infer from remains and archaeological remains that are found associated with these species. Mm-hmm. Where can we infer that sort of maybe modern human-like behavior is appearing in the hominid fossil record? And so he says that he thinks that we first see modern human brain sizes and behavior coming into existence with a species known as Homo heidelbergensis that lived somewhere between 500,000 to 750,000 years ago. Then he looks at the genetic evidence, and there have actually been some good genetic studies done by both people in the ID camp and then also a theistic evolutionist named Joshua Swamidass. And together what those genetic analyses have shown is that you could reduce all of human modern day genetic diversity back to an initial pair that lived at least 500,000 years ago. And sort of if we just make standard evolutionary assumptions, we're assuming that human population progressed sort of in a very natural manner, that if we assume that there was an initial pair or initial couple that lived about 500,000 years ago, we could account for all of known modern day human genetic diversity from that initial pair. Essentially, the idea that Adam and Eve are our sole genetic ancestors and our sole progenitors. You can take that sort of traditional biblical view of Adam and Eve being our sole genetic and genealogical ancestors living at 500,000 years ago, and the science all adds up. So together, using the fossil evidence and the genetic evidence, what William Lane Craig does is he says that I think that Homo heidelbergensis could have been the species of Adam and Eve about 550,000 years ago. That's sort of his argument. And therefore, he says that Adam and Eve are compatible with a standard evolutionary view of human history.
Yeah. So is that a new argument that he's making? I mean, what's new about that argument in your assessment on the science?
Well, I think to actually locate Adam and Eve within a specific species and sort of not questioning any of the evolutionary view and just saying, look, if we just accept everything that evolutionary models are saying about human origins, that I can still identify where Adam and Eve could have lived. I don't think anybody has actually done that before. And we're talking about historical Adam and Eve. Because remember, from his analysis of the Old and New Testaments, he finds that Adam and Eve were historical people according to the Bible, a conclusion I personally agree with, and I would affirm him in making those conclusions. So he says that, look, we can fit Adam and Eve within a standard evolutionary view of human history and sort of meld the two together. And in a certain sense, there's apologetic value to what he's doing. He's saying, look, if we just assume that there's this evolutionary view of human history that's true, we can still believe in a historical Adam and Eve. Now, that historical Adam and Eve may not be the traditional Adam and Eve that I think Christians and Jews have traditionally believed in over the millennia. There's some problems when I say historical Adam and Eve. I don't necessarily mean the biblical Adam and Eve or the traditional Adam and Eve that Jews and Christians have believed in. But he does believe in an actual Adam and Eve who actually existed as people who were in some sense our ancestors.
So before we unpack a little bit more of the details of that, I want to ask you one more question on the first half of the book. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of our time there because this is, again, as a scientist, your training really kind of gets us more to the second half. But in one of your blog posts you talked about this fantastical element of what Craig brought to mind. You said, now this is something that's important because in 2017, you wrote a book or a contributor to a book on theistic evolution. And there's a 650-page book, massive volume, really a great thing that dealt with the philosophy, the theology, and the science of theistic evolution. And so you're a heavy critic of that sort of approach, which Craig sort of assumes is true for the sake of his book. So what he counts as fantastical, though, you say, ends up being a little bit subjective. So can you elaborate on that point and why it's a concern to you as it leads into the science side, maybe even?
Sure. So Craig's argument for parts of Genesis being myth is based upon this argument he makes that Genesis 1 through 11 contain what he calls fantastical elements that are palpably false. And one of the ways he looks at this is, well, did even the author of Genesis believe what he was saying when he wrote these things, or she or they? He doesn't necessarily take the Mosaic interpretation. He certainly is very much supportive of the documentary hypothesis kind of view. So, but whoever wrote Genesis, did they even believe what they were writing? And so sometimes Craig will say, well, clearly the author of Genesis doesn't believe this is true. One of the examples he gives is the fruit that Adam and Eve ate from the tree. He says that this is palpably false, that no one would believe in he calls it a magical fruit where if you eat it, it gives you some kind of divine knowledge of right and wrong. And I'm thinking, well, how does he know what the author of Genesis believed was true or false? And why couldn't the author of Genesis have believed that God could create a tree in a very different world, the early creation of man, where if Adam and Eve ate from that tree, then, they would, somehow their eyes would be open and they would understand right and wrong. So I don't know how Craig knows that the author of Genesis didn't believe that was actually true. To me, it seems very subjective. And it reminded me of what Stephen Jay Gould wrote in his book, The Panda's Thumb, where Stephen Jay Gould sees these supposed features of biology that seem to be flawed. And he says, no sensible God would make these things. It's like he wants to believe in this perfectly rational God. And of course, if you believe in a perfectly rational God, then of course God thinks exactly the way you do all the time. And when he doesn't, then clearly God's not behaving well. God needs to get back in his box and think the way you do. And I felt like William Lane Craig was kind of doing that. And of course, the Bible teaches that God's ways are not our ways. I mean, Isaiah 55 is a famous passage that God's ways are higher than our ways. And I know that's sometimes seen as a cop-out argument that Christians will take. But the reality is, you can't think that just because this is weird for you, that therefore it must be false. And I think that a lot of Christians and Jews and people of faith who believe in Genesis and apologists of the Bible have found many very reasonable interpretations for some of these aspects of Genesis that seem a little bit weird.
This is my framing. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think he creates a sort of straw man argument in terms of how he frames both young Earth and even old Earth creation arguments to make his case of that Adam and Eve evolved from lower primates, and somehow this is where he does allow a magical interaction of God to change some genetic thing. He doesn't say it happened or not. He doesn't claim to have any knowledge. He just sort of said it could have happened, whatever. But somehow these evolutionary process essentially brought in the first two humans. They were distinct from all the other hominids outside. That's his case. But you're right. He does sort of present it as this horns of this dilemma, which I think is a false dilemma, is that you either believe this over literalistic young earth creationist view, or you believe my view of mythohistory, which is very reasonable and nobody could reject this because this is just rock solid. That's sort of the framing that you get for this at the beginning. And so in your assessment, because you traveled in these circles, both young earth, old earth, and of course intelligent design for a lot of years, and this is an area where you do have some insight and expertise, how do you think he does in framing that? Do you have concerns about the way he did, maybe just the old earth, the young earth, or you can touch on any part that you think just jumps out as the most important?
I'm an old earther, and as far as I can remember, I've always been an old earther. So I certainly do take an old earth interpretation of Genesis. I do take a very high view of Scripture. I do believe that Genesis is history, but I think that when you interpret Genesis, even interpreting it literally, you can very easily, in my opinion, especially when you look at the original Hebrew and the meaning of the Hebrew, I think it's very easy to fit an old interpretation of Genesis with the text. So I'm sort of was dismayed that he said that Genesis has to be interpreted only in a young Earth context. And I don't think that's true. And there are some very basic old Earth arguments about how to interpret Genesis that Craig just completely ignores. For example, in English, when we interpret the word day for Genesis 1, it's the Hebrew word yom. And the word yom, of course, can mean a 24-hour day. That's a very legitimate interpretation of that word. But it can also mean an indefinite period of time. Well, old Earthers certainly will commonly say, well, I think that when the original Hebrew in Genesis 1 says yom, we can take that to mean an indefinite period of time. We don't have to take that as a 24-hour day. For me personally, I buy that argument. Well, Craig doesn't even mention that argument. He doesn't even mention...
as an alternative to his view. Again,
he doesn't even talk about the word yom and what it can possibly mean. It's like one of the most basic old Earth arguments you make when you're looking at Genesis. He just says, we have to interpret Genesis in a young Earth fashion. He also makes this point that, and this is a bit more nuanced, but he says that when the flood happened, if you take a local flood view of Genesis, that there were hominids who existed outside of the Mesopotamian region that would not have been wiped out by a local Mesopotamian flood. And so therefore, because these hominids survived the flood, it therefore is an inconsistency with the biblical text to try to sort of fit a local old Earth view of the flood.
He calls that an Old Testament inconsistency, not an inconsistency with maybe the young Earth interpretation.
No, it's not a young Earth. Right? Yeah, this is an argument against old Earthers who are trying to sort of take a view that fits an old Earth view of the science with the text. And this then gets to... So this is actually an argument against old Earth science, old Earth interpretation.
This is where it's coming in there.
Yeah, this is one of the few times... Sorry, I should have made that clear.
No, that's fine. That's why I'm asking, was make sure we're all tracking.
This is one of the few times he actually makes an argument against sort of an old Earth interpretation of Genesis, where he would then favor that it's just myth. Okay? We shouldn't even try to fit Genesis with science. We're just going to go the myth route. And he says that because an old Earth local flood view of Genesis has hominids who lived outside that local Mesopotamian flood surviving the flood, and whereas the Bible teaches that all of humanity was killed off in the flood, that therefore that's an inconsistency and we cannot buy into this sort of old Earth local flood interpretation of Genesis to reconcile Genesis with science. Well, if you look at what many old Earthers will say that these other hominids are not actually descendants of Adam and Eve. And that, for example, Reasons to Believe, I'm sure you know this, you work with them, they will say that Neanderthals and Homo erectus are not necessarily genetically related to us as modern humans. And that they were a different species that were created outside the garden, and they were not meant to be created in the image of God, and we did not interbreed or even necessarily interact with them the way that modern humans, all of us today, are part of the same family species. Okay, fine. So, but he doesn't mention that fact that old Earthers will interpret the hominid fossil record in that manner and say that these other hominids are not descendants of Adam and Eve. There's a very easy solution that old Earthers offer to the dilemma that Craig poses. What about these other hominids? He basically misrepresents old Earth science. And then if you're a young Earther and you want to believe in a young Earth interpretation, okay, fine. I mean, I have many young Earth friends. I typically don't go around getting involved with this debate, and I'm not going to try to convince people one way or the other is right now. I'm an old Earther. But for young Earthers, I know what they believe, and Craig's argument against their science, I think a young Earther is going to feel like he really misrepresented what their science says.
And I have plenty of friends on that side. I'm involved in the young Earth side too, and just affirming is like, I know a lot of young Earth folks that that's not... He's arguing something that we're not arguing. Maybe people argued that 30 years ago as young Earth creationists or something, but they just don't feel like it's representing where they're at.
Yeah, I mean, the way that Craig says, I mean, there's many places I guess he might go with this, but where he goes to say that the young Earth science is clearly wrong is he says that young Earth creationists believe that all the diversity of dinosaurs had to evolve in 300 years after the flood, or that all the tectonic plates had to move in 300 years after the flood. Well, I don't know any young Earthers who say that. As far as dinosaurs go, I think most young Earthers would say that the diversity of dinosaurs died out in the flood and got fossilized during the flood. And yeah, I don't know what they would say happened after the flood, but they would never say that you have to evolve the full diversity of dinosaurs we know from the fossil record after the flood, because most of that got wiped out. And then as far as the plate tectonics goes, my understanding of what most young Earthers say today is that the plates moved during the flood. Now, whether that makes more or less sense than them moving after the flood, it's not for me to say,
not the point,
but he's misrepresenting their model. And so a lot of young Earthers are going to feel like he did not engage well with their science, And a lot of old earthers are going to feel like he didn't engage at all with their hermeneutics. And so I think that most young earth and old earth creationists are going to look at Craig's arguments that you can't fit Genesis with science, whether through an old earth or a young earth lens. And they're going to feel like he did not engage with their methods of doing that reconciliation and sort of just made a beeline straight to the conclusion that Genesis is myth. Mytho-history. And he didn't do a good job of actually dealing with how Christians try to reconcile Genesis with science.
Yeah.
And if they felt like that, I would be in 100% agreement that he did not engage well with those models.
Yeah, that was my sort of first take when I was reading through it the first time. Just like sort of, this doesn't seem like this is, again, that's why I chose the word straw man, because as a philosopher kind of guy, reading what I've read over the years, the stuff that Craig has written, I feel like he fell into that trap, and it was just a little disconcerting. Let's move into the science, though, and get a little more deep into where your field of expertise is. And in your series, you do cover some of this. Craig's appealed to sort of these miracle mutations, evolution in this process of the evolution of human intelligence, right? So why should Christians be skeptical then of Craig's interpretation of the consensus science, especially as it relates to like something like pseudogenes?
Yeah.
Right?
So what's a pseudogene? Maybe we should define that really quick
do that real quick
for your listeners. So pseudogenes are, according to an evolutionary view, they are thought to be copies of genes that we have in our genome, but they appear to be broken, and they don't produce a functional protein the way that the functional copies of those genes produce a functional protein. Or sometimes we'll have a pseudogene that doesn't look like any other gene in our bodies, but it at the end of the day, it looks like a gene, but yet there's some kind of a mutation or what you might call a stop codon that prevents a functional protein from being created from that gene. So according to an evolutionary view, and Craig actually uses the term broken pseudogenes in multiple places in his book, they look like a copy of a gene that is broken. And in some cases, we share these pseudogenes with apes, chimpanzees and other apes. And Craig argues that they are therefore evidence of our common ancestry that we share with apes. Okay, now I'm a skeptic of common ancestry.
Yeah.
So I have asked the question whether pseudogenes actually do provide evidence for common ancestry. But the way the argument goes is that God would never put into our genomes a piece of broken DNA in the same place that he put a piece of broken DNA into a chimp genome. So if we have a shared non-functional stretch of DNA with a chimpanzee, then the best explanation for that is going to be inheritance from a common ancestor rather than sort of independent common design for some functional reason where we both needed that same gene to perform some function. Well, you can't say that about a pseudogene because it seems to be non-functional. Therefore, it's better to explain it by common ancestry. That's sort of what he doesn't make this explicit in the book, but that's the argument he's trying to make.
Yeah.
So the question that I always have asked about pseudogenes is, are they really non-functional DNA? Are we really talking about broken genes that don't do anything for our bodies? And if you take the standard evolutionary view and you don't dig too deeply, that is the consensus view. But the literature is full. I mean, it's full of scientific papers that are discovering functions for pseudogenes.
Yeah.
And what we thought...
It's been a big change over the last, how long would you say that started the shift?
10 to 15 years.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. The last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a whole slew of papers that have come out reporting various functions. In some cases, finding specific functions for specific pseudogenes. In other cases, finding that pseudogenes in mass will produce proteins. We may not know what they're doing, but they are actually yielding proteins. Or they're not necessarily being converted into proteins, but they're producing RNA. And those RNAs can perform regulatory functions to actually regulate the protein coding version of the gene. So the reason we have these stretches of DNA in our genomes that look like a protein, even look like a functional gene in our DNA, but they don't produce a protein, they only produce RNAs because that RNA has to have some similarity to the protein coding version of the gene's RNA so it can regulate expression of that gene. So there are important elements, there are important control and regulatory elements of our genome. They're supposed to be there for a reason. They're supposed to look like the protein coding version of the gene for a reason, and they're supposed to not produce a protein for a reason.
And now, does Craig interact with any of those studies and research, the literature over the last 10, 15 years that would make that case of, well, pseudogenes really are functional? Does he demonstrate in the book itself any awareness of that potential weakness in that using that argument.
Unfortunately, he doesn't. And again, of course, Craig is not a scientist. I'm not necessarily expecting him to engage deeply with the science, but in other areas, he does engage deeply with the science. And it's sort of the science that's being fed to him by theistic evolutionists for the most part. Okay. Yeah. So unfortunately, when he does engage, it's basically who has his ear. It's very clear that theistic evolutionists have his ear. And I think that's probably
because he wanted to make that case.
He wanted to make that case. So it's a strategic choice on his part to try to show that a historical Adam and Eve, not necessarily traditional Adam and Eve, but historical Adam and Eve are compatible with evolutionary science. And there could be some value in doing that, but no, he does not dig into this literature at all. So in my blog post, and also I'm going to be coming out with an article in Christian Research Journal that really digs into this even more deeply. The literature is very clear that there is a paradigm shift that has gone on in the laboratory over the last 15 years. While theistic evolutionists were going around telling the church that you have to believe in common ancestry for humans and chimps because of pseudogenes, because of this other issue of human genetic diversity. Maybe we'll get into that later on.
Yeah, we will. Yeah, touch on that. But
they're making these arguments that we have to believe that Adam and Eve didn't exist. We have to believe in human-ape common ancestry. While they were out there preaching this to the church, scientists in the lab have made a completely different mindset of how pseudogenes work. You can find all these papers from top journals saying we should no longer view pseudogenes as junk DNA, because this is really a junk DNA argument. And you can find all these papers from journals like Nature Review Genetics, journals like Cell, saying we should no longer view these aspects of our genome, these pseudogenes, and they're even saying we should stop using the word pseudogene.
Yeah,
because they look crazy. Like functional control elements.
Because it seems like then what's really happening is that Christians are responding by adapting our theology or our hermeneutical methods to accommodate views that are a decade old in terms of how we were responding to science. So it's one thing to say, yes, we need to engage with science, but if you're going to do that, you need to engage with the current state of where it's at, and not because what's popular, in the world, like what people understand, isn't necessarily what's current in the science. And I think that's the distinction that you're bringing out with that idea of pseudogenes and the challenges to accepting Craig's view, which of course he doesn't even say is true anyway, and which I would ultimately argue that's fine because I don't think it is. I think there's too many gaps in the argument for it to make sense that way.
I mean, let me say this, Joe. Theistic evolutionists for the last 10 years, since 2000, even before 2011, the last 15 years, have been really heavily pushing on the church this idea that the evolutionary origin of humans is settled science, and that we share a common ancestor with apes, that there was never a time when Adam and Eve could have existed where humanity could have been reduced to a single pair of individuals. And they've been telling the church that this is settled science. And I'm telling you right now, hands down, it is not settled science. The science is not settled. The scientific arguments, when you dig into the literature and you look at what the literature is actually saying about pseudogenes, about junk DNA, about human genetic diversity, and what population genetics says about whether we could ever have been reduced to an initial pair, the science is not settled. It's a talking point that the evolutionists are using, the settled science talking point, to try to get people to stop actually looking at what the science says, sort of to be a conversation stopper, and to have you no longer question evolutionary science. Because in their view, when Christians do that, it makes us look bad, and it's a bad witness to the world. But I'm telling you right now, if we care more about truth, we care more about science than we care about evolution, the science is not settled, and the literature is testifying to that.
Well, let me ask you this, and another sort of, it's an area of the book of Craig's book that I find odd, and I don't know, maybe you can have an answer to this that I haven't read. So one of the things is, you mentioned this in an earlier answer. Craig says that humans, Adam and Eve, were the first human pair, and he uses a word to describe it called the fountainhead of humanity, which I find an odd word choice because it's not theological, it's not scientific, it's just sort of his own new word. Instead of saying sole progenitor, which would be a biological.
A fountain can have many streams.
Yeah.
I don't know what that means.
Well, that's exactly. So he says the fountainhead, but then in the closing parts of the book, when he's summarizing a lot of his stuff, and in several places, he'll use that Adam and Eve were the genealogical ancestors of all living humans. But that's actually two different claims, because to say that Adam and Eve are the biological ancestors is not the same as what Swamidas, because that's who he's borrowing for Josh Swamidas' book, Genealogical Adam and Eve. He's saying genealogical ancestry is not biological ancestry.
I agree with you 100%. It was very difficult to sometimes understand exactly what William Lane Craig's model is of human origins. Sometimes he seems to say that he likes the genealogical Adam and Eve model. Sometimes he says, no, that entails bestiality. That entails Adam and Eve's offspring interbreeding with essentially these animals. But what is clear, though, is that he rejects a model of Adam and Eve where they were specially created by God and did not interbreed with these other hominids. Mm-hmm. So basically the view that they were specially created by God and they are our sole ancestors.
Okay. So that's what comes across to you.
That to me is really the traditional view of Adam and Eve, that they were specially created by God separately from the apes, and they are our sole ancestors. Okay. Genealogically and genetically speaking, they're our sole ancestors. It is very clear that he rejects that traditional view of Adam and Eve in favor of some other model of Adam and Eve, where they essentially, we share a common ancestry with apes. Okay.
So at some point down the road, maybe hundreds of thousands of years later, after, Adam and Eve became the first of humans, maybe there's other hominids breeding into the line. You think is that what he's leaving the case open for?
It's not always clear. It's either one of two things. Either Adam and Eve were specially created by God, and their offspring interbred with all these other hominids that evolved. Kind of basically, that's the genealogical Adam and Eve model. Or, I'm doing my best to interpret him here. Or Adam and Eve basically are themselves directly descended from ape-like creatures. Okay? Yeah. And maybe they were given some special mutations by God. It's not always clear on that either. But in that case, they could be our sole genetic ancestors and our sole genealogical ancestors. They don't have to be, but they could be. But they weren't specially created by God. Okay. Or they are sole genealogical ancestor. I'm sorry. Let me take this again.
I know, it's a lot of words.
It's really confusing.
This is why it's hard. I mean, folks understand. Yeah. This is a lot. That's why I'm glad you corrected me.
I fleshed this out in my blog post. So I didn't have to, say it perfectly. Read part 4 of my blog series.
It's challenging to unpack.
Okay, so either they are our sole genetic ancestors, but they were not specially created by God. Okay, or they were specially created by God, but they were not our sole genetic ancestors. All right, you can't have both if you want to believe in that we share a common ancestry with apes today. All right, and William Lane Craig, it's to me it's confusing because he seems like he wants to have both, but then he wants to also have common ancestry. You can't have all three of those. You can't have special creation. You can't have sole ancestors, and you can't have common ancestry all in one model.
Yeah, and that's I think that's my sense of my confusion when I read this. I'm like, these things inherently, one might exclude the other, and maybe you can find this two works some way, or maybe these two, but not all three of those approaches. And that's and I'm trying to explore with a lot of people who have different fields of expertise to say, does this make sense to anybody? So far,
I got it. I understood it for like 10 minutes when I wrote part 4 of my blog series. So read that. You'll get a really clear explanation.
We can be intimidated to shy away from our biblical convictions because the weight of what people say, it's the science or whatever. And again, we did touch on that earlier, but put a fine point on that in terms of what you think the mentality of Christians going forward really needs to be as we continue these conversations, right? We're not dismissing these conversations. We're trying to extend them. But what should we keep in mind as we're engaging?
I think the point is that we should never assume that the science for evolution is so strong that as evangelicals, we're not allowed to question it. And let me tell a little story that helps make this point that actually will also be another positive thing to say about William Lane Craig. So in 2011, there was a Christianity Today cover story that highlighted all of these theistic evolutionists that are affiliated with BioLogos. That's the theistic evolution group that Francis Collins founded in 2007. And they were heavily promoting in this article this idea that a historical Adam and Eve could never have existed. And their argument was basically that modern day human genetic diversity is so great that we could never have been reduced to an initial pair of just two individuals.
Yeah, that was impossible.
It was impossible. Yes. It was supposed to be this knockdown, drag-out argument against the existence of Adam and Eve as our historical progenitors ever in the history of humanity. Okay? So, And they really heavily promoted this argument to the church. And they're saying that we need to reinterpret Genesis. Adam and Eve are not historical people. It's allegory. It's this, it's that. All these different new ideas about, rejecting various aspects of traditional Christian doctrine on Adam and Eve and rethinking all this stuff. Okay. So William Lane Craig makes a point in his book that those genetic arguments against Adam and Eve ever having existed turned out to be false. Okay. And this was work that was done by some folks both inside and outside the ID community. Some of the names that come to mind would be Ann Gager, Ola Holscher, Richard Buggs, Joshua Swamidas, who's not an ID guy, but the four of them did some really interesting conversation actually with Dennis Venema, who was the main...
Who wrote one of the books that promoted that idea that Adam and Eve as a soul pair would be impossible.
Yes, right. Dennis Venema was a scientist affiliated with BioLogos. He was quoted in that 2011 Christianity Today article. He wrote a book in 2017 called Adam and the Genome.
With Scott McKnight was his co-author.
Scott McKnight, the theologian. Yep, scholar, exactly. Yeah. Yep, no, that's right. And they said, I'm sure you know all this, Joe.
That's great.
Yeah, they said in that book that they know with heliocentric certainty that Adam and Eve could never have existed, that humanity could never have been reduced to a single pair. They said that was as solid as the conclusion that the earth goes around the sun. Yeah. Okay. So you're talking about intimidating people. Talk about going around telling people that if you believe in Adam and Eve, that's like being a geocentrist, where you that ancient view that the earth is at the center of the solar system, but we all know has been false for hundreds of years. Okay. That's intimidating to people. Yeah. But it turns out that the science behind that claim was wrong. And various people, some of those scientists I just mentioned, and others as well, I think actually Stephen Schaffner, who's a theistic evolutionist as well, in dialogue with Dennis Venema and some of the folks who were promoting that view at BioLogos, got BioLogos and Dennis Venema to admit that they were wrong. Now, this is to their credit. I mean, Venema and BioLogos should be commended that they acknowledge that actually the whole premise of these arguments that they made for basically a decade were wrong. That Adam and Eve could not have existed, okay? So if the argument is wrong, then what does this tell us? It tells us that sometimes evolutionary science against what we believe to be, important Christian doctrines.
Consensus.
Yeah,
science,
the consensus of evolution, it's not always right.
Yeah.
And so sometimes when we're being told, even by really well-intentioned, well-credentialed evolutionary scientists who are Christians, that you need to give up 2,000 plus year old doctrines because of the settled science of the evolutionary consensus, that even that consensus can be wrong. Mm-hmm. It's not necessary.
And it doesn't take that long to figure it out sometimes. I mean, there might be generations in the past that had false beliefs about something, and generations to resolve it. We've seen these shifts within years, within a decade and that one. But sometimes because our science is so advancing, there's so many people studying these things, sometimes there's things that come out in January that are by December, we're like, oh, I can't believe that article made it in, because it's just so much new information coming. So I think that idea of not being intimidated by what seems like just the bright people in the room or the intelligent people taking a view, we don't have to be embarrassed by our commitment to a biblical doctrine, because God was there, we weren't. And the science, by definition, it needs revolutionaries. It needs rebels who will speak against consensus, because that's how we refine our thinking. And so it will change eventually, some of it, and so we got to be patient. We don't have to be scared of that. I think that's kind of your big point that just coming across there, the life lesson. Right?
Adopt a wait and see approach to these kinds of questions is much wiser. And I think that it also says that there's this assumption among certain evangelical elites that if you question evolution, then you're doing junk science and you're making the church look bad. But you know what? Sometimes the shoe can be on the other foot. It's actually those who are pushing evolution that get things wrong. And I'm not saying they should look bad. I mean, people get things wrong. It happens, all right? But if you're so worried about getting something wrong and bringing shame upon the name of Jesus Christ, all right, you know what? Then we got to admit that sometimes it's accepting evolution and pushing evolution can be the view that's actually wrong.
Yeah.
And if you're so worried about looking bad, then we need to overturn that assumption that we should never question evolution. Should not be exactly, Joe, exactly. Well put. It should never be our default assumption. We should be willing to question that assumption.
Yeah.
So the irony of all this, though, is that because we know that Adam and Eve could have been reduced that the human population could have been reduced to a single pair of individuals a few 100,000 years ago. We don't need the genealogical Adam and Eve model.
Yeah.
We don't need it because we don't need to explain the origin of humanity from this population of thousands anymore.
Yeah.
So I'm scratching my head. Why
That's
are
actually a good
William
point. I
Lane
haven't really thought
Craig
in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, why are William Lane Craig and his sort of his colleague Joshua Swamidass, who's also a very smart guy, why are they so strongly promoting the genealogical Adam and Eve model when the science
it's solving, in other words, a problem that doesn't exist anymore.
And to Craig's credit, in his book, he talks about the fact that biologos arguments against
there's a whole very
initial
extensive review
yes,
on that,
he talks about how this genetic argument against Adam and Eve was wrong, and he actually cites Ann Gager, Ola Hoster, Richard Buggs, and Joshua Swamidass, and the work that they did, some separate analyses they did, showing that this biologos argument against Adam and Eve was wrong. But then he goes back to the genealogical Adam and Eve model.
Yeah.
And of course, I think it does have to do for Craig, it's the pseudogene argument, okay? And this is where, again, I would urge people think that the pseudogene argument is this knockdown, dragged out argument that you have to have common ancestry of humans and apes. And I'm saying is, let's learn the lesson from the debate over Adam and Eve here with regards to pseudogenes. A lot of folks are not learning the lesson that we learned from this debate with biologos over the human genetic diversity, and they're making the same mistake there with regards to pseudogenes. And they're saying pseudogenes are such clear evidence for human-ape common ancestry. We can't. It's the evolutionary consensus. We can't question it. And I'm telling you, not just because I tend to be a Darwin skeptic, because I've read the literature. I mean, it's there. The papers are there. The evidence is there. If you want to look at the literature and find evidence that pseudogenes are key functional regulatory control elements of the genome. If you want to find that evidence, those arguments, it's there in the literature for you. So let's not repeat the mistake from the debate over Adam and Eve that we already see that the evolutionary consensus was wrong. Let's not repeat that mistake again by saying we have to accept the consensus on pseudogenes.
Yeah. No, this has been a great summary of what you've written in those articles as well. And I think for many people, they'll hear from you a very clear presentation of how this has sort of unfolded over time and how we got to the point of Craig's book, but how his book fits into that context, not just within the sense of his argument, but that broader discussion of science and faith and where we as Christians have to go. So that last question for you then, who should read this book? Who is it really for? And who do you think should take it? Because it's a big book. Is it relevant for people to read? Who should read it? Why should they care about it? What is your take on that?
Well, I'll tell you the number one person I would suggest this book for, and I don't know if I have a friend who fits into this category right now. Maybe I do and I don't know it. But I've had a friend who was an atheist or not a Christian, and they were saying, look, I'm fully committed to an evolutionary view of human origins. I just cannot escape that. But I also see that the Bible says I should believe in historical Adam and Eve. Is there a way to reconcile the two? And, whether I agree with the reconciliation fully, I would say, you know what? This is the book for you. And Quest for Historical Adam is going to show you how to reconcile a historical Adam and Eve, may not be the traditional Adam and Eve, but it's a historical Adam and Eve of some flavor with a fully evolutionary view of human origins, okay? Because I believe that, someone becoming a Christian is more important than what they believe about, some of the nuances of a theology of Adam and Eve.
And I think the last thing I would say on that too is I think the people that maybe might want to read this is just some of our, especially leaders in the church who, you've got a lot of young people who are going to school because they're going to read these books in school and this is going to get put out there and it's going to be used as a textbook in places, despite I think the limitations of it. So it's important that people be aware of it, even if it's not for agreement, it's for the sake of understanding where this dialogue is going and where they're at. So I appreciate your time, man.
Thank you, Joe. It's been a lot of fun.
It's good to have you here visiting in Southern California, and appreciate your heart for this and just all the work you guys are doing at Discovery Institute and just on your own. Some of the stuff you're writing and putting out in the books. It's good stuff, and I hope folks will tune into what you're doing. I hope you'll come back and join me for the next episode where I'll continue to raise the roof and sow the seed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.